So good afternoon. Thank you all so much for sticking with us through an exciting but intense day of content moderation at scale. Before we dive right in, I wanted to start with a little example that I think frames this particular topic about sort of automation in content moderation. So for those of you who are fans of the television show Silicon Valley, you might remember an important piece from last season, plot point that revolved around a confusion between Oculus, the virtual reality company, and Octopus, the sea animal, sea creature. And in the midst of a confusion between Oculus and Octopus, the seafood company ended up, Jin Yang developed an app that became Hot Dog, Not Hot Dog. And what the app did, and HBO was gracious enough to actually make the app, which is available in the iTunes Store and elsewhere, if you want to go download it, is you can take a picture of something, and the app will tell you if it's a hot dog or not a hot dog. And that has uses. They are somewhat more limited than the VCs in the show envisioned those uses being, but they nonetheless sold the company for a couple $1 million to Periscope. So the reason I tell you this example, and the reason I sort of raise the example of hot dog, not hot dog, is sort of twofold. One is, I think it demonstrates, if you're familiar with the show, the limits of automation in content moderation. Good for certain things, good for the tasks it's built for, hard to expand naturally beyond that without a lot of sort of investment of time and engineering resources. The other reason is, and this sort of gets to this discussion, is when you're dealing with challenges of content moderation at scale in technology, there's a tendency to want to use technology to help solve some of those problems. And so what I'm hoping we'll get to explore today is where that works well and where it doesn't. I'm fortunate to be joined, sort of going far end all the way down, by Peter Stern, Policy Manager for Risk at Facebook, Casey Burton, Senior Corporate Counsel at Match Group, Frank Carey, who's a machine learning engineer at Vimeo, and Ryan Kennedy, who's a senior manager and head of moderation at Twitch. So let's sort of start with the obvious question. We've heard a couple of examples. Peter talked this morning about Facebook using automation for spam and for sort of repeated posting issues. We heard about AutoMod, a feature at Twitch. What are the instances where automation, where using technologies has really helped tackle some of the challenges that we've been talking about throughout the day? It's free for anyone.
I guess I'll go ahead and start. I think machines are great when there's really no ambiguity for the content you're looking to kind of take down or remove. Great example is, I think, a solution we all have something, or an issue we all have a solution for is spam. So you kind of know what spam looks like. You have a pattern of what a spam account looks like, and once you develop those patterns, you can now deploy automation against those patterns when you're spotting those in real time. And where you don't have confidence, you can then bring in human reviewers to kind of update those patterns and label your data to maintain its effectiveness. And then also, in terms of AutoMod, that's more an option we provide to creators who want to foster a certain type of community. So some might be more family-oriented, and they just want to turn off profanity entirely because this is not a community that they want to create a space for. And of course, we provide that option to them.
So I think something to keep in mind is that machine learning, like humans, are never 100%. So when going into these, either automation or specifically machine learning driven projects, that you set what the thresholds of success are up front. It will never be 100%, but sometimes like an 80% solution will, depending on your use case, that will be the way to go. But sometimes you need something very, very accurate, like 99% or higher. A good example is in some of our spam fighting efforts, we had at Vimeo people posting what traditionally would be, in other contexts, like they would write spam like an email that you're familiar with. We had video spam, which sort of, people making it look like, it was the latest, greatest movie that was coming out, and it would get about 10 seconds into it, and then it would have a black screen with a link on it and say, hey, go to this link to download the full thing. what was interesting about it is it's a very visual example versus kind of text where you've seen before. There's many things you could bring to bear on that problem. You could do like text recognition. You could look for, in this case, a lot of the content had like, it would be a 2-hour-long video, by the way. So the first 10 seconds would be something, and then the rest of the 2 hours basically just be black and with a link that says, go download this thing. But what's interesting is with these cases, especially around spam, is that these are adversarial examples, right? So if you have just sort of content moderation, people using words that you'd rather them not use, they're not like actively, they're not making money off of it, right? But when you have a situation where someone's making money off of it, the stakes are different. As Sean said earlier, you know, we're vastly outnumbered by the folks who are putting this stuff together. And something to keep in mind is not only machine learning for recognizing the content, but machine learning and automation is being used to generate the content as well. So it's really kind of an arms race between the two. So it's important, like upfront, to set what the threshold you think you will need. In our case, we had a great model that had very few, like 5 nines type of false positive rate was very, very, very low. And you need that because we had so much content that if it was even like 0.1%, it'd be thousands of accounts per day, and we don't want to remove users unnecessarily. But like I said, you're with an adversarial model, so we had these very good models, and as we would implement these machine learning models, they would work really well. They'd go through QA, take some time to do that. We publish them out, and then like within days, we would see that the people would change tactics and try something else. So we got to the point where we realized we actually needed to automate our automation, like sort of to learn on the fly from these things. Other companies that have a lot more resources like Facebook are doing this like hourly. And so that's sort of the direction we wanted to go in, which maybe I'll talk more about later.
Yeah, so for me, I think what machines are really good at, and I think somebody used this phrase earlier, is the known knowns, right? When you know what you know, the machine then can iterate on that and really flesh out exactly what the bad behavior looks like. I think, like we've heard before, what is really easy, or maybe not really easy to do, but what is easiest for machines to do is find the spam accounts or the bots or things that are, not acting like a human. So if you are sending, I think like I said earlier, sending, 100 messages in the first minute that you're on site, you're probably not a real human. And so then you'll get removed. Similar things like that. Or if you're, using the same message over and over again, instead of tailoring it, all these are different signs of being bots that machines and algorithms can pick up relatively easily. I think the other thing that machines and algorithms are really useful for are for ordering the review, figuring out here are high priority, here are low priority, here are things that really look like fraud, here are things that really don't look like fraud that you may not want to review, and then here's the kind of bucket in the middle that then you can kind of weight accordingly. So from that standpoint, the machine is a tool then to assist your human reviewers as opposed to being kind of the end of the process in itself.
Yeah, for Facebook, I really agree with all of that framing. We are often asked about how we're going to deploy AI or other techniques to solve some really difficult problems on our site. And a lot of the response takes the form of, it's not just like flipping a switch. There has to be room for human judgment. There has to be room for discretion and escalation. I thought the exercise that we undertook during lunch was really, really interesting and revealing in that regard. All of that said, where we can use AI deliberately and thoughtfully to remove content that violates our policies from the platform, then we want to do that. We want to do that so that people don't have to see stuff that violates our policies. We'd like to remove that quickly. And a lot of what I'm going to be saying is contained in or sketched out in a blog post from the vice president of our community integrity organization, Guy Rosen, that came out on May 2nd. So you may want to take a look at that. But just adding a little bit more detail around some of those items as they bear on the topic today. So as was said before, in some areas, we've gotten pretty good at recognizing stuff, like spam, fake accounts. We know a series of signals that we can look for when it comes to fake accounts, and we're good at taking those down. We do a lot of that. Also nudity. We now have classifiers that are pretty accurate, and particularly commercial stuff, we're able to spot that and remove it quickly. Then we get into areas that are very important, that are more complicated, that we've done a lot of work on, like terrorism. We've had a series of blog posts over the past year about how we've used automation in service of our terrorism efforts. And it's really always a combination of automation and human review. We have gotten particularly good at spotting terrorist propaganda. Videos and photos, much of it coming from official terrorist channels. And the numbers are large. Now in 2018, in Q1, we were able to remove almost 2 million pieces of ISIS and Al-Qaeda propaganda. 99% of that was taken down before it was actually reported, with the median time on site being very low, less than a minute. So we regard that as progress. And of course, we want to do that consistent with leaving room for counter speech on the platform, because we know terrorist images also get shared to condemn, to draw attention to the evils of terrorism, and that is important to be on our site. So we don't want to take that off the table. We want to leave that there, but we do want to get rid of as much of the bad stuff as we can, as quickly as we can. In the terrorism area, we also use AI in a couple of other areas. Where we identify terrorist accounts, we will typically fan out to try to find related accounts. That involves the use of human judgment, but AI also helps us looking at signals like what are friend connections, what are shared addresses or devices. That's not the end of the story, but those are useful data points for us to use. And recidivism, that's a recurring issue that we deal with on Facebook. We've also gotten better at identifying when the same bad guy pops up using a new account, and we're able to shut those down quickly. So terrorism is, I think, a good reflection of how we try to get the best of all of these elements. Suicide prevention is another, has been a big focus for us over the past few years, and we've now also been able to use pattern recognition to identify instances where people are expressing suicidal ideation, and where we're able to then have humans take a look at what's going on, determine whether we can send resources or potentially even contact law enforcement. And there have been a number of cases in which we've been able to help people, which is terrific and gratifying for the team and what we should be doing. And then one other item was also mentioned in the blog post, graphic violence. We're now able not to remove, but to put up warning screens when we see certain types of graphic violence, which again, and I think people have mentioned it today, there's a lot to be said for graphic violence warning screens, other types of warning screens. They leave content on the site, but they give people some protection and allow them to have a little bit more control around their experience on the platform. So we regard all those things as good. Maybe I'll circle back to talk about areas that are more difficult, unless you want me to get into that.
No, I think that actually tees up the next question really nicely, right? So if there's a set of categories of things that automation is good to deal with, there's presumably a set of categories of things that automation isn't as well equipped to deal with. And Peter, maybe we could start with you and head back this way, because you started, especially in the terrorism discussion, talking about the role for humans. And so I'm curious, are there things that either where you believe, sort of based on where the technology is, there's always going to be a human in the loop, and is it possible to sort of categorize those things similarly?
Well, I don't know if I would use the word always, but definitely for the foreseeable future, when it comes to hate speech, there's going to be a large role for human judgment in the process. We have started to use signals operating on things like slurs and certain types of speech to bubble up content for our reviewers to take a look at. We don't remove content based on the operation of this technology, but it, in some cases, tells us what to look at. And that has been helpful. it gives us confidence that we're still going to be applying our policies correctly because we have our regular reviewers doing that work, but we're getting more eyes on stuff and more eyes on the right stuff. So that is an area where we're making progress, but there's still much to be done. And I mean, I think a lot of people today have pointed out the difficulties in that type of area. Very dependent on context, difficult issues of reading text, which typically is more difficult than dealing with images. Slurs, are they self-referential? Are they a joke? Are they vicious? You really need somebody who understands the language and the context to make that kind of determination. We don't want to over-remove a speech. We take that seriously, just as seriously as we do speech that violates our policies. So we want to get the right nuances, and we want to get to the right result, and we're trying to blend the best of all the approaches available.
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of that. It's funny, there are certain things that would seem to be something that machines could do really easily. One of the things that we have had a problem with in the past is people putting text overlays on images. It started out relatively easily. People put a block of Times New Roman text on there, and you can OCR that relatively easily. But like we've said throughout all of these panels, the people who are trying to misuse the sites are in an arms race against the people trying to prevent the misuse. And so now you get a lot of different types of, if somebody wants to put text on a page, maybe they put one letter in one corner, a letter in another corner, and so on. And the machine then has a much more difficult time figuring out that that's a block of text. Or if somebody is trying to handwrite something, again, that becomes a bigger challenge. That's something that we saw, maybe a year ago was a big problem, and it's something that we've now worked really hard to try to fix, and machines have gotten better about that. So it is really, in addition to what are machines good at, it's where do we want to devote resources to trying to figure out the problem. And so, if certain things are a problem for certain platforms, you're going to get more focus on it from those platforms. I think the other types of things that machines aren't really great at is, and this is probably pretty obvious, is where there's nuance involved, right? I think Peter said, noted a lot of those. Again, on our site, we don't get too much on the political side or the activism side. But for something like on our site that we see a lot, is something, when you're trying to describe what sort of person you'd like to date, and you have a very specific set of requests, is that something that is okay, or is this going to be going too far? Like if I say I only want to date white people, or I only want to date black people, how do you deal with that? Or if you go even further and, if you're trying to describe some sort of, perhaps deviant sexual behavior, where do you draw the line on that? So there is always going to be a place for human review. No matter how good your sorting is, no matter how good your algorithms are, the human element is always going to be there because it is your site. It's how you want your users to feel when they're on the site. It's the image that you want to portray to the public, and I think the human side of that is irreplaceable.
So basically, I think a good rule of thumb that you can think about when, will machine learning be appropriate for my problem? It's a rule of thumb. It's not perfect. We got these images up here that we were moderating for about 2 minutes before we had to make a decision. Imagine having to do that like under a second. That'll sort of give you a rough approximation of like the things that machine learning will be good at if it's something that you could do in under a second. So for instance, nudity detection is a good one. Pretty quickly you can zero in, and nudity detection works pretty well. But one of the challenges, like where that context comes up. So we see, you're spending time with the image, you're sort of thinking through it. you basically knew a ton about the world. For AI to get to that level where it would know like, okay, this is a Ku Klux Klan member outfit without explicitly seeing it there. Like, we have a ways to go to get there. But this sort of 80-20 rule applies here. So you can get, with sort of 20% of the work, you can get 80% of the way. So when we're talking about like ranking, this is obviously something we want to get rid of, and this is something that maybe is lower on the priority list. That's a good place to start and think about it. Places where it's been really challenging, like I said kind of earlier, we're just around, we're dealing with an adversarial actor, and you can get something that works really well and is very specific, and you can basically, it's sort of like a laser beam. And if they sort of just move a little to the left, the laser beam doesn't hit them anymore. So what we ended up doing in that case to get things to work better is we actually created two models, sort of we call it like a narrow net and a wide net. Where the narrow net model was like, we were very confident in that it would work well and it wouldn't have a false positive rate. If they changed, if they moved away from where we were targeting them, that was okay. We wouldn't have like users being removed from the site unnecessarily. But with the wider net, that went to review queue. So even when you find that like your model or even a vendor that you're using gets some things wrong, you can look at some things like confidence scores or the way you've trained your model to be kind of wide or narrow to figure out whether it's something that's going to go into review or something you can use automatically.
Yeah, I can really only add to everyone else's comments. I think, especially if you're interested in building a community, I think we can all agree that's why we do what we do. You always really need that human element as part of your solution on fostering a healthy and safe community. And so for us, it's, again, similar to your solutions, it's about kind of researching, where are your adversaries like headed in terms of new ways to attack your site. So in that sense, your human reviewers are kind of like your R&D department, and your automation is the weapons you're kind of launching against your adversaries. And so it's really up to the community and our moderators to kind of surface these new challenges for us to kind of iterate on our models and our data so that our machines remain effective, and then that our moderation solution in general is more effective, especially as you need to scale up.
All right. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
I think the other thing to note here is that we keep saying that machines aren't perfect, but obviously humans aren't perfect either, right? We say that sending something to a human is, I guess, the gold standard, but humans make mistakes. They're going to see a piece of content, and just like we were all doing out here today, there's going to be disagreement, and or they're going to just get it wrong, right? We may say, you have to take nudity down. They see a piece of nudity and they just click the wrong button, right? I mean, that's going to happen, 0.1% of the time. And again, you're reviewing millions of these things, and you're going to have, bad content get up, even in the best of intentions, sending everybody through a manual queue. So while it's great to send stuff to humans as well, there's probably stuff that machines are just better at that you want to make sure that you send through the machines if you can.
So now that I've successfully asked the two questions that were embedded in the panel title, I think we're going to dive into some of the sort of important nuances in here. And I do think that sets the stage really nicely for one of the immediate questions that I had, and sort of thank you for bringing that up, is we tend not to forgive machines when they make mistakes, but we're fairly forgiving sometimes, maybe, of humans when they do make mistakes. And so that sort of raises the question of what's an acceptable error rate. So one resource, just to flag for folks if they're interested in this topic, is Nick Feemster from Princeton and Evan Engstrom from Engine had a terrific report on the sort of limits of automated filtering that goes into a bunch of examples. One of the examples they highlight in the report is the example of EchoPrint, which does fingerprinting for audio files. And it has a 1% to 2% error rate based on some studies that were being done, and companies like Spotify use EchoPrint, at least according to the report I read, to sort of match songs for various purposes. 1% to 2% is a really high level of error, and so I'm wondering, to the extent you can talk about sort of different applications, what a target confidence level is. What is an acceptable error rate? How much does it vary application to application or specific sort of instance? I'm going to start with Frank just because you're the engineer on the panel, and hopefully everyone else won't stare angrily at me.
I think it's important to consider the way we usually you get a grade back from your teacher. It's like a 0 to 100 score, right? It's like that's sort of how we're ingrained about it. There's actually kind of two key types of errors that come in: false positives and false negatives. And it's very contextual about how important you get that error rate. So I'll give two quick examples. So spam being one where if let's say it's your inbox, right? If 1% or 2% of the time you are missing emails and they ended up in your spam folder. This happened to us last week, actually. Thanks, Microsoft. That can be a very bad experience for the user, right? So it's you have a very low error rate, but that's still a bad experience for the user. So that's sort of one side of the spectrum. Another side of the spectrum is say a cancer screening. With the cancer screening, you want you're very willing to have a high false positive rate, maybe 80%. So, but basically that's saying is I got a test for cancer. It says I have cancer, but I probably don't have cancer, right? It's just sort of a very wide net, and it's saying you should probably go for a second screening, because the downside is if I don't catch that, right? If I don't cast as wide a net there, I'm telling someone they don't have cancer, they don't get that treatment, they don't get the follow-up. So it's very contextual about what are you going to do with the information? What are you going to do with that prediction? And what are the biggest downsides? I'll pass to the next.
Yeah, so let me ask maybe a follow-up to the question then, right? So one of the items one of the points that tends to come up in these discussions is questions around diversity of moderators. We heard extensively about this morning, diversity of training data, especially if you're using sort of machine learning techniques in content moderation. And there are 5 white guys on this panel. And so I'm sure if someone hasn't asked on Twitter yet, we're going to get a question about, there's a lack of diversity of perspectives on this panel right now. And so if you're making content moderation decisions, there were a number of companies that spoke very publicly about the need to incorporate a diverse array of perspectives internally as they're doing content moderation. Whether it's Frank or someone else wants to jump in on this, how do you think about sort of the importance of diversity in automated processes in particular?
Well, it's definitely a big issue, and it's something, there's a very large discussion now in many, many different industries across the policy spectrum on this issue, as there should be, and we're watching that and participating in that very closely. I mean, I guess there are a couple of things that I would say that we do to try to address that. We are seeking to build a diverse workforce, both in terms of the reviewers that we use, whose work ends up being integral to the machine learning because they're the ones who do the content review and the labeling that will then get used to build classifiers that will be expanded upon. So diversity both there and on the policy team as well, because the issue of potential bias and lack of diversity in terms of the line drawing is also an issue that we need to be aware of and to address. When we are doing work to create classifiers that involves labeling, we try to be very careful about whether we're seeing outlying results from any individual. So we'll be mindful that if somebody's results diverge from those of other people, that may be a signal that somebody needs more education, somebody is not quite as tied in to what we're trying to do as they might be. So that's another way we try to correct. We also try to be very detailed and objective in the tasks that we set for the labelers. We're not asking them to make subjective judgments of any kind. So to take a simple example, the issue would not be, do you see sexually suggestive content? The question would be, do you see a swimsuit? Do you see whatever else it might be that then in the aggregate would go into making up the thing that we're trying to build? And then I guess finally one point that came out in the post that Guy Rosen had last week, is that the classifiers are built, or at least the hate speech classifier that we're working on is built based on posts and comments from content that was reported by users and that came into us and that was determined to violate. That element to user flagging is important. Sometimes people ask, does it matter that we have, do user reports matter anymore? And they do, for a variety of reasons. One important reason being that they help us get these signals that we can then use to build out and expand and hopefully get even better than human reviewers, but have to go through this process.
So, Ryan, one thing that struck me this morning in the discussion of Twitch was some of the unique challenges that live presents. And, credit to my colleague Neil, who's here today, he flagged for me a really interesting example on Twitch of sort of a social norm evolving out of really nothing, and that's based around Bob Ross. So for those of you who don't know Bob Ross, the guy who paints, Twitch ran a marathon of every Bob Ross video all in a row. And all of these Bob Ross fanatics came out of the woodworks to live watch Bob Ross. And every time Bob Ross would say, beat the devil out of the brush, everyone would comment on the video, RIP devil. And so suddenly out of nowhere, based on this sort of like funny and playful example of content sort of finding a new life and a new home, you have this whole new meme that's developed around that you wouldn't have a basis of training data around, and you wouldn't have a way to necessarily understand. And it strikes me that RIP devil could be taken to mean any number of things, and most people wouldn't immediately associate it with painting. And so, I was wondering if you could talk about, the ways in which, especially around live video and the cross-format nature of Twitch, automation plays a role in that moderation.
Yeah, I think that, excuse me, I think the unique thing about Twitch is the interplay between chat and what's occurring on stream. And I think that's what you're talking about, but it occurs across Twitch. So it's really important that, machines are a necessary solution you have to deploy when you're moderating content that's occurring at such high velocity and also in real time. Things are evolving in real time. So it's important that you're managing it, you're bringing forth that community perspective, the cultural perspective that your moderators have to use, and they're deploying that in real time to kind of manage the machine. So you're spotting these behavior, and through the lenses that you have to moderate that content, make a real-time determination, a rapid one, because this is content that kind of lives in the moment. You don't have the opportunity to sort of hold that review and restore it later. You have to make a snap decision. So from that perspective, it's about kind of managing our data, our patterns that we're using with our machines in real time, on the basis of how people are using these means that kind of evolve. But it's a constant sort of managing of machines, so to speak.
Go ahead.
Well, I sort of wanted to swing back to the bias for a second. Yeah. So we kind of talked about, sort of bias in the workforce and making sure that, whether it's labelers or people QAing it or people of different backgrounds and different perspectives. But there's also implicit bias in the data that I think everyone who has either working with machine learning teams or going that direction should just be aware of. For instance, and a lot of it's, not sort of some evil actor, just sort of the way things have happened. So for instance, a lot of the training sets that are out there, ImageNet and others, if you look at the people involved there's a lot of white American bias towards the people that are captured in those photos. So you have to be very careful about if you're training data. Nudity data is a good example. It's similar with nude photos. It's mostly women, not men, right, that are represented there. So you have to make sure that you're thinking about those things, your teams are thinking about those things as you're putting these things in place, because the bias is already there in the training data, and you have to go out of your way to make sure you're removing it. Similar thing with WordNet. So WordNet is basically a list of all the synonyms and things like that. It sort of gives you a fingerprint for each word. There's a paper that came out last year showing how things like doctor are implicitly shown to be more masculine, like a fingerprint, than other things like, say, a nurse, which tend to be more feminine in a fingerprint. It's not somebody's the machine learning engineer is not creating that. Just, we have all this text over, decades and decades that we're learning from. And so the machine is dumb, right? It will just pick up the biases that have been there in the society, and it depends on the society you're training on. So, it's, culture as well. We have very good English coverage for many things, but for many of the languages, we don't. So that's something to keep in mind as you go through.
So, a lot of the tech that we've been talking about building is unique, it's customized, it's meant to fit the particular norms and rules of each platform. And resources aren't limitless. And so maybe I'll ask this to everyone but Peter. Sorry, Peter. Is for, folks who are quite frankly from smaller companies, oftentimes there's a push towards out-of-the-box solutions or outsourced solutions to help close that sort of resource gap. How good are those solutions? What are the sort of big benefits to them? I mean, other than sort of cost, and what are the downsides to relying on things like that?
Sure, I guess I can start. Yeah, I think that looking to outsource vendors for a lot of these content moderation tools is a really great idea. We've got experience with a lot of different, I think that everybody's kind of talked about nudity, whether that's Google Vision or Microsoft Azure or some product like that. Those are good, photo recognition tools that you can use to find nudity and take it down off your site. So for smaller players, those are all kind of good options to use. That said, I think you need to, and we have, even if you're not a huge player, take a look and say, hey, what is really affecting our platform, and build specific tools. Maybe they're based off of some of these existing technologies. Just one example, as like a shared resource NCMEC has, and Microsoft helped put out PhotoDNA, which is a registry of photo hashes for child exploitation images. And that's all great, and you can use that to make sure you get kind of, again, the known knowns off your site. But that's not something that we see a lot on our site, so it's a good tool to make sure that you have the known knowns down and off of your platform, but it doesn't necessarily take that next step of going and finding the next egregious one before it gets caught and pulled back into the NCMEC databases. So trying to develop something that's on your own and putting together, how to find whatever insert the bad action is that particularly affects your site is, we found, kind of the way to go, because nobody else is going to care about it as much as you do when it's the issue that particularly hits you.
Yeah, I think there's this kind of constant tug between going with a vendor and doing it in-house. There's a certain level of investment from infrastructure and a team, having the right data. If you're a very small company that doesn't have a lot of data to train off of, it's not always very easy to get at some of the data that you'd want, like say fraud data and things like that. I have a kind of a specific case for Vimeo was. Nudity detection for most platforms is just like, we don't allow nudity, right? I assume Twitch is just zero nudity. I'm assuming zero nudity, and we've established, including breastfeeding, zero nudity, right? So that's a very, across the board, a simple nudity detection would work for all of these folks. But for Vimeo, as Sean mentioned earlier, we actually have, some acceptance for artistic nudity and things. So that didn't work for us. We could at least use it to identify it and queue it up. But what we want to do is try to automate it as much as possible. So in our case, we actually had to have levels of nudity. This is content that's been removed from the site because it was extremely pornographic, versus this was just HBO late night TV or something like that. And so we actually had to train our own model that did pretty well. And so if it didn't, it would at least put it in these sort of buckets that we could predict how bad was the nudity, and then you can start to rank it and things like that. But these off-the-shelf models don't provide that. Similarly, I assume Twitch has memes and things like that come up on the site that are very specific to that site. The tastes of sites are different. So my sense is, for the foreseeable, we'll have these vendors that are great for getting off the ground, getting something going, but then you may find that either A, they're not catching certain things that are coming up that are sort of code word people are using, or it's catching too many things because the words it was trained on, Vimeo, we have a lot of people using film terms on the site, which may have a different meaning at other places. What was it? Financial accountant, personal financial accountants or something, right? So these things mean different things in different sites, different contexts. So it's often a balance between the two.
Yeah, I think at this point, users are they have certain expectations when it comes to spam and nudity. It's easily identifiable, and I think we're all developing solutions, iterating on those to quickly take them down. So at some point, you've got to meet those user expectations when you're scaling up your operations, you're in that startup stage. So yeah, these third-party solutions, they're good for sort of bootstrapping your operations, but at some point, you have to develop your own dictionaries, your own data, because especially in the case for emotes, a dictionary another vendor provides us is only going to get so far when a lot of the abuse we see occur might involve very Twitch specific language. But I do think they're very helpful in terms of the broader industry adopting standards across the board, sort of the green means go, red means stop, that kind of thing on a very fundamental level, and sort of raising all ships in this bumpy sea around content moderation. I think that's really important. Yeah.
So far we've spent a lot of time talking about detection and the sort of actions that get taken. One piece that's come up a little bit, when we were talking about the surface area for users and other sort of contexts is the actual communication with users and the user experience. And so, Peter, maybe if I can start with you, when you think about serving an audience that's 2 billion plus people around the world, you can't personally write them all in email. And so what role does automation play in communicating with users after a decision has been made and in the sort of appeals process that comes afterwards?
Sure. Well, I think all of that is very important, and it's an area where we have been trying to make up ground. Historically, we've not been as good as we wanted to be, both in terms of appeals and user messaging. It's very important for people to understand that they have an understanding of why something got taken down or why something didn't get taken down. And we have made progress in those areas. And now, pretty much across the spectrum, in most instances, if something is taken down that you put up on Facebook, you will get an indication from us as to why that was the case. That's certainly true with the new appeals mechanism. And appeals are just really important. It allows you, I think, to have maybe a little bit more confidence in your processes, because you know that if you screw something up, people are going to be able to get it corrected the second time around. We've been hearing people tell us that for a long time. I'm really happy that we've been able to start now allow post-level appeals, and we're going to be expanding that throughout the year.
How do you decide how much information to share with them? In one way, you don't want to say okay, model X123, you tested positive for that, because then they can sort of, I failed that test, I can try this other thing, right? Versus something that's just very generic, it was taken down because it violated something, we think.
I think we want people to know the nature of the policy that they violated. Where did they cross the line? And I think you're suggesting a kind of a difficult something that we have been thinking about for a long time, which is by providing more information, do you provide incentives and methodologies for people to game the system? And I think that conundrum is always going to be there, and there are different ways to look at the problem. We believe that there's real value in transparency, and we are really trying to accelerate the way that we show people how we're operating, how we're interacting with their content. And if we show them where the line is, then maybe they know where not to go across it. And so that's kind of the way we're seeing it now.
Yeah, I think to that point, we have there's a way to treat kind of the bots or the automated accounts differently than you would treat the human accounts. I think that's kind of where we've seen probably some of the most value, where you're not giving the bots notice that you're doing certain things. You're placing them into a purgatory or into a whatever else where only bots exist, and you know, they can go off and have their fun. But and then not giving them the signals so that they can adapt, because they do adapt, and they adapt fast.
Faster than humans.
Exactly. And so, yeah, so I think not giving those folks the notice, as it were. But yeah, and I think we're in the same boat where it's more you violated the terms of use, and we're not going to really get into the details about what exactly that violation is for the most part. A lot of that is to protect users, right? Like if you know, you're showing interest in two different people on a dating site and one of them reports you, like, we don't want to provide the detail that might allow the bad actor to figure out who reported them, just as a safety issue, right? Like, you don't want that bad actor then going after whoever made the report. And so that's generally why we've decided to say, we're just going to keep this at a really high level. Your account has been removed, or your content's been removed for a violation of the terms of service.
So let me ask a question to sort of conclude, which is thinking, say, over the next couple of years, if this group sort of gathered back together, you know, some number of years from now, what does good look like? You know, as we think about sort of moderating content at scale, what are signs that as a community, these sort of set of private actors have taken responsible decisions, and what would it look like if we've sort of failed?
I'll take that one. I think a true goal that you know, we may not share that information with the users, but I think internally we are at a place where we're kind of throwing together technology and it works for 90% of the cases, but we don't always know why people fall into one bucket or the next, and it's this issue of interpretability of the model, being able to audit the model and say, like, is it making the decisions that we think it should be making? And that can be challenging, especially around like vision, but there are more tools coming to the forefront. I'd like to see, like, in a year that the practitioners of this, the moderators who have to handle the responses, have a good interface to say, like, why was this decision made in an interpretable way, even if behind the scenes there's a lot of complex machine learning.
So on that note, which appropriately enough